to explain the benefits of systems approach, I have to say that there are two key components to systems. The first is the easiest to understand. Systems is about the connections between things. A lot of the time, science succeeds by breaking a complex problem down into bits and understanding how all the bits work. And then if you understand how all the bits work, you understand how the whole thing works. Now, that's true of a lot of mechanical stuff, but it's not true when it comes to things like biology, ecology, and systems. Because in those cases, it's the connections between things that are as important or even more important than the properties of the things themselves. So a system behavior is often governed by the connections, not by the properties of things. So that's the first bit. Systems is holistic. It looks at the connections. Now, the second bit, and this is harder to understand initially anyway, is that people's view, people's understanding, people's way of seeing the world is different from mine, and it's different from yours. And when people see the world in a different way, that makes a big difference to how they behave and interpret things. There's an example that I can use to illustrate this. So I was working on a project, antisocial behavior in Manchester. And there were lots of people who were addressing this project. There were people in youth services, there were people in the crime unit, there were people in housing, there were people in education. They were all concerned with the prevalence of youth nuisance in Manchester. It was a big problem. As part of this project, I went and interviewed them all. The youth crime people, their way of seeing this, they said, look, these young people are just taking the piss. They're awful. They're rude, they're disrespectful. We should just lock them up and throw away the key. That'll end the problem. And then I go and see youth services. And they say, listen, we're the first people to get our budgets cut. Do you know there's not one youth club left open in Manchester? What are these kids supposed to do? They come home from school. It's too crowded at home. They go out on the street. There's nothing for them to do. It's because we've stopped giving them youth services. That's the problem. If we opened up a few sports facilities or a youth centre, the problem might get solved. That was their view. The next group are the people in housing. And they say, well, actually, we don't think it's the kids' problem. It's the parents. The parents aren't teaching the kids how to behave. They're not disciplining them. They're not telling them what to do. We should be focusing on telling the parents off. We should be getting the parents to be better parents, not trying to punish the kids. It's not their fault they haven't been taught properly. Oh, okay. And then I meet another person. He was one of the people working with these kids. He was a youth leader out on the street with them. He said, listen, he said, this problem doesn't happen on middle class estates. This problem only happens on working class estates where there's poverty. He said most of these kids have got single parents who are in dire straits. They've got 4 kids in 2 bedrooms and they've got no money for a TV or inadequate food. I mean, this is a poverty problem. This has got nothing to do with anything else. So you start to see that one issue, like youth nuisance, and people are seeing it completely differently. Not only are they seeing it differently, but they think the solution is very different. And they argue between themselves. They're trying to win the argument instead of helping the kids. So the second big part of systems thinking is to appreciate that other people see the world differently from me, and they see the world differently from everybody else. And that multiple perspectives is hard to let in. It means I'm not right about everything. It means that the way I'm seeing things might not be the most helpful. But if you really, really want to see the system, you have to know that everybody in it is seeing it slightly differently. So it's the connections and seeing it differently. When you've understood that, you're in a much better position to handle managing an organization, a system, anything. That's really, it's getting those two things really under your belt.
We're living in a complex world of a myriad of interconnected elements. For those in leadership roles tasked with making sense of this world and seeking to positively address its problems, more and more of them are finding that a systems thinking approach is an enormous help. This film explores the theory and practical implementation of system thinking through the work of Jake Chapman and his colleagues over the last 50 years. Our story starts in the early days of the brand new Open University in Milton Keynes.
The Open University, which was the best idea the Wilson government of the 1960s had, it was the most radical experiment in university education in certainly modern British history. Effectively, what happened is that a group of academics, of whom I was luckily one, were given a greenfield site and asked to reimagine the university as an institution. And we were free to do what we wanted. And that was quite extraordinary at the time. Of course, the other thing about the Open University, and the thing that made it really radical, is that it was the first institution, certainly third-level institution in the United Kingdom, where you could enter without any qualifications. Anybody could go to the Open University, but anybody.
It was to this very young, radical institution that Jake Chapman came as a physics lecturer in 1970. He had an interest in energy, and in that spirit of freedom, decided to establish an energy research group which went on to do important work, especially in the field of energy efficiency, in a collaboration with architects from Milton Keynes Development Corporation. In 1975, his influential groundbreaking book, Fuel's Paradise, was published. It was one of the first books to highlight the dangers of climate change and what might be done to reduce its impact. The reaction to the book awakened Jake's interest in systems thinking.
In hindsight, I can see that actually Fuel's Paradise was a pretty good systems analysis of the energy problem, but I didn't know it at the time. It's like a lot of people come to systems without knowing that that's what they're doing, and I was one of those. So it was when I gave talks based on Fuel's Paradise that people started to fill me in, and I started to really understand that yes, this is a complex system, and the answers are nowhere near as easy as I thought. It was a slow process, starting off. I'm a physicist, and a bit of technology, a bit of economics, now some politics. Oh, we've got a whole system here. And that was really how it came about.
Jake was in the right place to learn more about systems thinking because his OU colleagues were developing unique courses in the subject under the leadership of Professor John Beeshan.
John Beeshan had an idiosyncratic style, and part of it was that he was looking for free thinkers. Because if you're forming a multidisciplinary group, you don't want people who are going to find it difficult talking across disciplines. So he had an agricultural scientist, operations researchers, psychologist, myself, a social researcher interested in alternative forms of organisation, and an engineer, John Norton.
This team of academics, mostly young academics, decided that what they wanted to do, they wanted to introduce systems ideas which they regarded as being vitally important to understand to undergraduates. There were three other institutions in Britain which were teaching some of this material, systems. They're all teaching it to postgraduates, and others people doing masters or people doing PhDs. Not only were we doing something that hadn't been done before, which is teaching systems ideas at undergraduate level, but also we were teaching people who came from everywhere, every walk of life, old and young, some of them in their 80s, some of them in their 20s.
John Beeshan wanted everybody to have a bit of systems and thought it would be good for them. But this was an innovation in undergraduate teaching. But the point was, it wasn't undergraduate teaching in a normal sense. These were people in the middle of complex organizations in many cases, who had a lot of life experience behind them. And that post-experience situation was what made the difference, and where the real impact came, and why they took something and ran with it. I mean, these were people who were busy. They may have been watching, they may have been at work all day. There's football on the telly. They'd put the children to bed. Why should they study our stuff? It had to be interesting, had to be relevant, had to speak to them. Otherwise, they weren't going to give it the time of day.
But, we have the opportunity to teach thousands of people these ideas. And that's why we were doing it at undergraduate level. The scale of these things by comparison with ordinary universities was vast. So I'm sure the first course, Systems Behaviour, the code was T241. Every presentation of it had maybe 500 students. So you think 4 or 5 presentations and you've got several thousand students. Just compare that with an ordinary university.
As far as I was concerned, it was a matter of wherever there was something that fitted, was in the spirit of what we were trying to do, then I would use it. I remember somebody alerted me to Colin Eden's work, Strathclyde University, on cognitive mapping, a simple diagramming technique, which allowed you to represent a person's thinking, or they could represent their own thinking in these terms. You could put them together and build a complex picture of the minds at work here. Great, I said, well, you will have that. Likewise, there was ideas from the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations on socio-technical systems. Yep, we can use that. So that was how we went about it.
I did mention that there were 3 other universities, Aston, City University in London, and the University of Lancaster, who were teaching systems when we started. And they were all teaching the approach to systems that engineers use, which is hard systems. I mean, for example, control systems. The automated machines that run, say, an oil refinery. They conveniently ignored the fact that many of the most important systems in society actually involve machines, and they also involve people. And that's what they couldn't handle. What happened was that one of those departments in Lancaster recruited a second professor called Peter Checkland. And Checkland had worked in ICI as a very experienced manager for many years. He was himself a chemist. And what he had understood very quickly is that if you're dealing with people, you can't treat them as if they were machines. He decided that the kind of analysis that was done in the other in Lancaster and the other 2 departments was what basically he called it hard systems analysis. And he thought rightly that only deals with half of the problem of managing things. The other bit is what he called soft systems analysis, and that's what he pioneered. The only problem was that Peter Checkland's ideas were very complex and sophisticated and difficult. And one of the contributions that I made and that my group made at the time is we found a way of teaching Peter Checkland's soft systems analysis to ordinary people.
It was in 1980, some 10 years after the establishment of the systems faculty at the OU, that Jake was encouraged to join it.
When I was running the energy research group, Milton Keynes Development Corporation seconded somebody to take over my lecturing duties in the physics department. This left me free to run the energy group. At the end of that process, which happened in 1979, the physics department said, come on, you've got to come back and work for us now. Now, by then, my interest had moved a long way from physics, really had. And simultaneously, somebody who was in the systems group at the Open University said, why don't you come and work with us? I thought that sounds a much better idea. But I knew nothing about what they were teaching. I had to learn in the same way that the undergraduates were learning. I had to learn the formal stuff about how to draw systems diagrams, what systems behavior meant, what hard and soft systems were and why they were different. And so I had to learn all that stuff. And the people there were very helpful. The people in the systems group welcomed me with open arms.
I was head of the department, I think, at the time, and we welcomed him. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made, I think. On the intellectual level, he understood almost intuitively what a systemic approach is like in an organisation. And he did a lot of work in the government and elsewhere afterwards. But the second thing was he was a great teacher. If Jake set out to explain something to you, then by the end of it you really understood it. Absolutely, but these people are quite very rare.
At the time Jake was joining the systems group, I was setting up a course team to create a course called Systems Organization, and invited him to join. The key innovation in this course was that we were asking students to apply the course ideas to their own experience and tell us how they got on in using them. That was controversial at the time, very widely adopted now, but that was seen as a bit dodgy. Anyway, I wrote the draft of the first unit with a distinction between messy problems and difficulties. And to help the students create the material they would need for the assignment, we had activities and exercises steadily through the text. And when Jake commented on this, I was really struck, because he didn't just comment on what I'd done, what I'd written. He shared all the activities and exercises that he had faithfully worked on himself. Ooh. Now that's A, a real commitment and engagement, and B, a degree of openness that was very striking. So he was a great colleague.
The thing that always attracted me about the Open University, the students were mature, they were studying at home. They weren't going out and getting drunk every night, or maybe they were, I don't know. And I said, well, how can we make this relevant to their lives? So my contribution to that course was to say, okay, this is a really good idea. How can we get them to make use of it in their own life? And that was sort of the way that I was contributing to the course. I was understanding the idea as the students would, and then thinking about ways that they could apply it.
When it came to Jake preparing his own unit of material on people in groups, he introduced his ideas for this, starting by saying, my goal in this is to help students improve their relationships at work. Now, what's striking about that is that almost anybody else would have answered the question in terms of the ideas they were going to teach. Jake did it from the learner's perspective. He was on the side of the learner, and there was a kind of moral purpose as well in that. It guided what he did. It was the clarity and focus of what he was doing that was so striking, and it was great material. Overall, all I can say is it was a great privilege to have Jake as a colleague, and in effect to be mentored by him. I learned a lot from that. He became an elder brother to me in lots of ways.
Jake became Professor of Energy Systems, but he also had other irons in the fire. In the late 1990s, he met someone who opened up new work opportunities.
My time as head of department at the systems group came to an end when I was seconded to run National Energy Services, which was the organization that developed energy ratings and the NHER and all that sort of stuff. And I was seconded to run that business for 4 years. Now, when I returned to the systems group, I found that my experience in the world of business left me less interested in academic issues. I knew that I was not going to be an academic for much longer. I had handed over being head of department to a man called Ray Iceland, Professor Ray Iceland. And he read a book called Connexivity by a man called Jeff Mulgan. And he knew that Jeff Mulgan was quite well respected in political circles. He had founded a think tank called Demos. He was a known advisor to the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair. So Ray thought, well, actually, I'm going to get Jeff to come to one of our small conferences that we run sometimes at the Open University. And I was going to go as well. And he thought, I know, it might be an idea if I get Jake and Jeff to be in the same group together. So that was how I first met Jeff Mulgan. I then organized early retirement, and I came to where I now live at the ripe old age of 55. This was 1999. And just as I'd finished doing up the house here, I received a letter from the Association for the Conservation of Energy. people I'd been working with, mostly in the business. And they said, we would like to put you forward to work on a resources project in the Performance and Innovation Unit in the Cabinet Office. And it may involve energy. I thought, me working in the Cabinet Office on energy, that's what I've been dreaming about doing for 30 years. So I said, okay. And I went to the interview and discovered that the man running the Performance and Innovation Unit was Jeff Morgan. I was a consultant in the Performance and Innovation Unit for 2 years, working on a resources project and then on an energy project. So I had lots of times when I would meet with Jeff, and we'd meet in the lift, we'd have a chat in the office, and we'd sometimes go out to lunch. And after a while, he said, look, I like what you said at the Open University about unintended consequences. He said that those are the worst thing. Every government policy we put out at the moment has more unintended consequences than intended consequences. I think it would be a good idea if you wrote something about that.
That something was system failure.
The idea for system failure as a piece of work and then a Demos pamphlet came from a conversation that I had with Jeff Morgan, who was the founding director of Demos in the 90s. And we were having a conversation about how to encourage systems thinking and a different perspective on some of these big issues. And Jeff suggested a conversation with Jake.
And that's how I shifted from being an academic to being somebody who worked at Demos, which was a very political organization.
It was a time in the early 2000s when there was a huge amount of pressure on the agenda for public service reform. And there was a lot of discussion about how to improve participation, service quality, outcomes in everything from education to prisons to courts to health services. But there were a lot of targets and there was a lot of central control around. And we were at Demos were looking for a way of really helping to stretch the thinking and to extend fresh thinking, but also to encourage a deeper understanding of what it might take to renew our institutions and these big service systems.
The metaphor that pretty well everybody used when talking about government policy was that the government was a machine. You have to pull the levers of power. The cogs of the machine are turning. Every way that they talked about it, it was like it was a machine. And my basic argument was, no, it's not a machine. It's a complex system. And complex systems don't like being treated like machines. They tend to adapt. So I was put in touch with a man, Nigel Edwards. He ran the NHS Confederation, and he liked my basic idea that institutions are really complex systems and not machines. And so he gave me lots of little stories about how treating something mechanically ended up diabolically going wrong. The stories are all there in System, and that's what people liked. They liked the fact that I was pointing out organizations and institutions are not machines. They are populated by people who have their own ideas, and they respond in ways that they think will work best. And they're not always the way that the policymaker or the minister thought about. So there are lots of unintended consequences. And if you want to avoid them, you have to talk to the people who are going to do the job. Targets are not entirely a bad idea because they do give people an incentive. They tell people what the government is prioritizing, and there's a measure involved. You can't have a qualitative target. You've got to have a quantum. You've got to have a number. And therein is the first problem. You might reach the numerical target by sacrificing quality. And in some areas like education and healthcare, the quality is probably more important than the quantity. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the system gets distorted by the target. So, okay, so here's an example from education. The government decided to rank schools by how many students got an A, B, or C at GCSE level, or it was one of the qualifications. So the number of students, the proportion of students get A, B, or C, that makes the school good, average, or bad. So what does the teacher do? Now, there are kids in the class who are getting A's and B's. He can ignore them. They're going to get A's and B's whatever he does. And there are kids at the bottom who are getting F and G who are never going to get up to a C. So what the teacher does, he focuses on the EDC students, the ones in the middle, and tries to get all of those up above C or B or A. So now the teaching has been distorted. The teacher is no longer paying as much attention to the very poor performing students or to the very well performing students. The government gets what it wants. It gets more students with A, B's and C's, but there are kids who haven't been as well educated as they might have been if the target hadn't been there. So targets distort the system. And everybody who's in a system with a target knows this. I just wrote about it and made it clear.
What we found was that people working in the public policy world that Demos occupied, but also crucially in the wider world of public services and civic institutions, very quickly related to these ideas, could understand what was the relevance and how they resonated with their own experiences, and then found them very valuable in seeking to apply and learn from more effective strategies to bring about positive change.
So why do I recommend systems failure to clients? I mean, I suppose particularly when I'm working in the domain of public policy, but also in other sectors, or with civil servants, it's always helpful to find, to have something that can be given to clients that had the same effect as it had for me 20 years ago. That it's a very straightforward, accessible introduction to systems thinking.
When System Failure was published, it got very good press reviews. The people who were political journalists read it and thought, this guy's onto something. In the civil service, when something comes out that somebody likes, they tell their mates about it. And I mean, you could buy System Failure for £10 on Amazon or from Demos, but you could download it for free from the Demos website as a PDF file. And it was downloaded tens of thousands of times, mostly by civil servants. And they said, oh, this is great. And they told their mate about it. Go and download this, have a read. Part of its appeal was just that it was for the first time a voice. Somebody was clearly saying something that was wrong with this mechanistic, target-focused way of trying to manage the civil service. I was suddenly invited to give talks everywhere. I'd give talks at the Treasury, give talks in Whitehall departments, give talks at Demos. Basically, that pamphlet opened up a whole new career for me as a systems teacher and a systems consultant. I mean, single-handed, just like that, bing, it did it. Amazing.
When we published System Failure, it helped to open up the way for a series of more applied collaborative projects, working with local councils and authorities in England and Scotland, working with police authorities and health agencies. And I think he really enjoyed getting to grips with not only how do we support systems analysis in these various situations, but also how do we work with these collaborative institutions to build up learning capability in a more applied sense.
Now there's some systems projects going on that some people are liking the outcomes. Ofgem and the Neighbourhood Renewal like what we did. There's all this buzz in the civil service about, well, system failure, it says that systems is an important part of being a public civil servant. And somebody who worked at the National School of Government suggested that I might like to contribute to this top management program. So the National School of Government in those days used to run lots of programs. I mean, literally hundreds a year for all sorts of people. But this top management program was designed for people who really wanted to become public sector leaders. And they said to me, well, could you teach some systems on this? And I said, look, I can give them all the theory, but that won't help. I said, in order to teach systems to these people at this level, we have to have a case study, and it has to be for real. It has to be a problem that somebody wants an answer to. And I will teach them some tools and some systems techniques. They will use them on that case study and give the person an answer. And I said, I'm pretty confident that any problem that a minister is stuck with is one that the mechanistic approach has failed on. So I'm pretty sure I'll be able to make progress on it. And they said, oh, how many days do you think that'll take? I said, well, a day to teach them the techniques, a day for them to interview people relevant to the problem, and a day for them to use new system technique to come up with an answer. 3 days. Okay, they said. Right at the beginning, when I first met the TMP group for the first time, I would say to them, look, I am not giving you something that will solve all your problems. You've already got most of that. You've already learned how to do that. That's why you're already in a fairly senior position. I said, what I'm giving you is something that will help when all your other methods have failed. The tools I'm going to teach you help you to get out of mental traps. One's a diagramming tool, one's a picture tool, one's a talking to yourself tool, one's talking to somebody else. Not all of these tools will work for you, but if one works for you, take it away, and the next time you're stuck, use it, and you'll get unstuck quicker.
David Wright was a civil servant at the National School for Government. In 2009, he took over as the director of the Top Management Programme.
And when I took it over, it was kind of in some problems. And the ethos I tried to move it towards was very much personal development focused. And I changed lots of things about it. But one of the things I didn't change was Jake in the second week running what he called his systems challenge.
These weren't nincompoop people I was talking to. These were potential chief constables, directors of everything, permanent secretary. These were highly intelligent people. They were very successful. And it went like a dream. They loved it. And they loved the fact that it was practical. It wasn't just mouthing theory at them. They were putting the ideas into use and seeing how they worked. The sorts of problems, the people who were running Kent County Council, they had missed their target for teenage pregnancies for the last 5 years. They didn't know what they were doing wrong. So they said, look, you've got to help us. How can we resolve this issue? Girls who get pregnant at a very young age, it ruins their life, ruins their career. What can we do to sort this out? How are other councils doing it? We're not doing it. Do you know, it took them 2 days to discover that the problem was nobody in the council was talking to the girls. Duh.
You've got this very messy situation that people are leading in. And so the first really powerful thing, I think, that Jake brought to the party was a way of thinking about this that wasn't reductive, didn't bring it down to what we need is a strategy, or whatever. He was much more sophisticated. He gave people, I thought, a much more sophisticated and messier view of the rather messy reality that they've faced. The second thing, I think, was that in the way that he thought about systems, he encouraged the participants to look through other people's eyes and not stand in their shoes. So, and for me, this was a really critical distinction, because quite often you'd get that, well, if I was them, I'd, if it was me, I would. Statements about, I don't know, people in a housing estate in Glasgow or something like that. Whereas Jake's was a much, kind of more powerful thing of what would the world look like through their eyes. And if you're doing a personal development program, getting people to lose their certainty of their wisdom and their authority and everything else, and to get them just to be curious about other people and how they stood, I think was really, really powerful.
I started doing that in 2006, and I did it 3 times a year. until 2012. And in each group, there were 24 people. You can work it out. There's quite a few thousand people went through that systems course and used the ideas and found that they worked.
There was a period in which every single senior civil servant going through the system at senior level would go through our hands. I mean, who can claim to have that sort of impact on the cultural evolution of the civil service? And you know, I frequently come across people inside the system who didn't go through our hands, but who now know about systems thinking because they've received it indirectly as a result of our teaching.
By 2007, I'd done half a dozen TMPs, and I knew I was onto something. And I knew it's not the sort of thing I could write an academic paper about, because it's just not academic enough. But that didn't mean it wasn't important. But I wanted other people to know about it, and I wanted to pass it on. I wanted to pass it on to people who could make use of it. Maybe teach TMP in the future or whatever. I didn't mind. So my main motivation was to pass on what I think I had discovered through the process of moving from academic systems, into demos, which is political systems, and now teaching senior public servants what's useful in systems. So basically, I looked around at people who I thought could use what I wanted to pass on.
I met Jake when I participated in a number of enlightenment intensives, so the meditation retreats and workshops that he and Eva, his wife, were running for many years, and got to know, hear and learn about Jake's systems work, particularly with Demos, but also at the Open University as Professor of Systems. And it just always seemed to ring a bell or chime with my experience of running services. At the time, I was a leader in the voluntary sector, so I designed and developed and led frontline services from alcohol and substance misuse, dual diagnosis, mental health assertive outreach, work with marginalised communities, in particular those from Black and minority ethnic groups.
At the risk of sounding like a Nepo baby, Jake's my stepdad, and I have obviously been in his orbit. The systems thinking piece that Jake got involved in through his work with Demos coincided with a point in my career where I was thinking, what can I do to actually make impact in the world, but in a way that's brings my own self into it, not just copying something of my parents. So that systems thinking group became a tryout ground for me as well in thinking about that stuff.
He gathered all the people, the younger people that he knew that he felt would benefit from his learning.
The fact that people came from slightly different experiences, backgrounds, characters, contexts, meant that we weren't a homogenous voice, but we were a collective voice of support to each other.
It was a motley crew. It was a brilliant group of people, actually. And I guess all of us at different points in life and trying to do different things in our work. I think Jake saw we shared some common interest, I guess. The systems approach had lit us up in some way.
We were quite different, and we came together with the purpose of mining Jake's mind for his understanding, his experience of using and drawing upon systems thinking and systems tools, and his plethora, his myriad of tools and techniques that could help organizations, partnerships, networks, leaders to apply the ideas. And really, the ideas are nothing without application.
We met every couple of months.
I think back to those times of just being in, around kitchen tables and having conversations that were really stretching my thinking.
And basically, I started to teach them what I had understood both from the academic systems world and from the demos political systems work, and now from what I was learning teaching the stuff on TMP.
None of us shared a tight fit with one another. And I think that served the group really well because it meant that we were excited by the idea that the techniques he was teaching applied to my work, but it applied to teaching dancing just as much.
There's something about Jake. So, I mean, I remember I used to call him my waster, my wise man, because I just felt like he had a way of understanding the world, which, like I say, it felt to me like it was opening up a different way of seeing the world. And so for me, it was a real opportunity to sort of think into what's my position on social change? How am I going to conduct myself in the world as someone who believes in being part of those efforts to make the world a better place.
And Jake brought both his own lived experience of living by and applying those tools and techniques and methodologies, but also a curiosity to see how it would work in other sectors and systems of which he was not a part.
It was a time of being deeply outside of my comfort zone, but also thinking, yeah, I think this is the path I want to go down. This is good stuff. I feel like I could do something here.
That was such a gift to be part of that systems group in my 20s. And it really has informed the way I've gone about my work ever since. It was an amazing time. I often say it was a bit like my second university education.
They didn't just like it, they latched onto it and put it to use. They're still doing it today, which for me is very rewarding, and they'll probably in their turn pass it on to somebody else.
Jake's work with his systems group has had a profound effect on its members who are using systems techniques in their work. Sophie Bruce is the CEO of the Centre for Relational Care. It is a think tank advocacy group based in New South Wales, Australia. It's committed to changing the system for out-of-home care for children and young people who are in the foster care system.
In New South Wales have been countless reports, for many years saying how child protection is not protecting kids, and how kids going into the system are coming out more harmed than when they went in. And, that's fundamentally against what, the whole principle of wanting to look after kids in communities. Now, I don't have a background in the out-of-home care sector. I don't have a background in foster care provision. But what I can offer to this audacious goal of transforming a system is a lens that says, unless we see the way that we've developed this care system as a construct, and that by design, the system is going to operate in a very self-serving way, unless we can see that, we're not going to do anything to change it. We're just going to start tweaking the edges. And it's hard. It's hard to be in the eye of complex work. So, I think it's really important for me as a practitioner, as somebody who wants to say, I want to enable others in this space. I think it's important for me to have skin in the game now to say, actually, when you're in it, it's hard work. It's hard to be an adaptive leader. It's hard to think about complex systems. My brain wants to go to linear, technical fixes straight away. What can we do right now, tomorrow? But I've got to think about everything as a long game, because the system's going to take a long time to change. As a person that wants to give a solution, I want to fix it tomorrow, but I know that any fix-it measure that happens tomorrow is not actually a long-term systems change. And it's all about helping people to see that we've built this paradigm of care around really harmful constructs, and we've got to break those constructs and build a whole different paradigm of care for this system to really change, and for the feedback loops that are happening in that system to work towards relationship, connection, love, care. Because at the moment, the relationships in the system work towards compliance, risk mitigation, regulation, ticking boxes.
Paul Ingram has been using his systems training in the debate on global nuclear disarmament and transatlantic security. He was the originator and developer of the Stepping Stones approach to nuclear disarmament that underpins the 16-nation Stockholm Initiative of non-nuclear weapon states, a platform to achieve concrete progress within nuclear disarmament diplomacy. Paul helped Jake teach on the Top Management Programme course. An inquiry from an attendee made him reappraise his approach to his work.
There was one moment when one of these senior civil servants came up to me and said, well, I can see how this is going to transform the way I manage my government department, but how do you engage in the nuclear weapons field and contested political environments in this systems approach? And I looked at him and I realized that I didn't apply it as effectively as I could have been in that moment. So a very important systems ethic here is to acknowledge the limits of one's own ability to understand the whole system and to recognize that there are a variety of perspectives. This is one of Jake's unique contributions to the field, is the imperative of understanding that we cannot have a holistic understanding of the whole, that we have to engage with varieties of perspectives. And so from that point on, I completely transformed my engagement with the nuclear weapons debate. The contribution that systems thinking, which Jake would describe as both holistic, so seeing the broader context, and pluralistic, bringing a variety of perspectives in, which requires humility and listening approach, is, to my mind, the closest thing I have come to expressing my instinctive approach towards peacemaking.
Sophia Parker is the Director of Emerging Futures at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. The Foundation is a long-established philanthropic organisation whose primary interest is in tackling the root causes of poverty.
Really, right from the start in taking on that role, I guess I wanted to bring a systemic view to how we go about working on our mission to relieve poverty. Is that if, as JRF, we are serious about a future free from poverty, we have to look at the root causes, like our founder told us to, and that those root causes must go beyond making the system as it is work a bit better, optimizing what we've got, and instead saying perhaps there are some things that we need to transform in the system itself. All of that analysis really has come from applying a living systems approach. So we've used the Bacana two-loop model, which is a living systems model, and that basically says change happens through paying attention to the energy at the edges, if you like. So in a living system, the innovation happens around the edges. Pay attention to that energy at the edges. Think about how we can bring more oxygen and resources to it. So we put some funding there. But actually also the power comes when these different experiments around the edges can start to connect up, tell a picture of the whole. It's very much finding people on the ground who are actively building. They're not writing about it in theory. They're not writing a clever pamphlet or having a debate. They are building something on the ground and showing what it looks like to actually put people and planet rather than profit at the heart of the work. One of the organisations that we're working with is called Red Hills, or the Pitman's Parliament. So it's up in Durham. And this is an incredible building. It's built on miners' dues back in the day. And it was used as a way of all the different local miners' groups coming together to make decisions and to support one another.
Driven by socialist principles and Methodist fervour, they challenge an economic system that condemned them to a life of poverty and insecurity.
They built the Durham Miners Association, a union that took on the unchecked power of the coal barons and won.
There's no reason our communities couldn't enjoy this economic power again.
Solidarity can help us win back the ground that we've lost. It can help us rebuild our community-owned assets.
And above all, it can help us rebuild hope.
There's a kind of real beauty to the work there. I think partly there is poetry in the mining banners, but also just the sense of a history to return to and how vital that is in times like this when we are living through, a huge transition and polycrisis.
He's not somebody who's precious about his own thinking. He's like, it's no good to me. I want it to be for the world. I think that's what makes him special, and I hope that that's something that I've learned from him along the way.
I think he is really unique because he is a true scientist, isn't he? He's very rigorous, precise, like interested in data, determined to experiment and be clear about what he's experimenting about. All of that is there. And he's incredibly spiritually attuned and aware of his own inner life and the kind of, invisible spiritual world around us. And I think it's the combination of those things that makes him so unusual.
All the different aspects of his life, to all of that, he brought a great curiosity, but he also brought a capacity to bring it all back to bear. So in his own sense, a holistic understanding of systems thinking, him in the system and the system in him.
I do make useful contributions, I know that. But the contributions I'm making are always based upon lots and lots of other people's work. Like all my system stuff, I'd read papers and books galore, and I was synthesizing it in a way that seemed to be most appropriate. But I didn't tell people, well, if you really want to understand this, you've got to read these 10 books. But that would be the truth. That would be the truth. So even though I talk about the things that I have done, I actually want to say that really my contributions have been quite small. They were the bit at the very end that did make a difference. But without all these other people, there wouldn't have been nothing. There wouldn't have been anything.